Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our second interactive plenary of the day for the Summer Institute for Educators, The Power of Art, Pathways to Critical Thinking and Social Emotional Learning. I'm Julie Carmine, and I am our Manager of National Teacher Programs, and I'm hosting this session with my colleagues Liz Diamond and Jessica Metzger. And we're very excited to have a special guest speaker today, Dr. Helen Immordino-Yang. And today's session is going to be about the brain science of emotion and cognition and critical thinking in driving the learning process. I'd like to introduce to you Mary Helen. Before I do, let me remind everyone that we are recording today's session, and we are also taking some still images that we may use for various purposes, as you can see here on the screen. And our anchor questions for the day we went over in the first plenary session. Today, this evening, or whatever time it is for you, 5:30 here on the East Coast, we'll be looking at the question, what does brain science say about the ways emotions and cognition work together to support learning? So Mary Helen's going to talk with us, and Mary Helen is a EDD. She is a professor of education, psychology, and neuroscience at the University of Southern California and the director of the USC Center for Effective Neuroscience Development, Learning, and Education, also known as CANDLE. She studies the psychological and neurobiological development of emotion and self-awareness and connections to social and cognitive and moral development in educational settings. She uses cross-cultural interdisciplinary studies of narratives and feelings to uncover experience-dependent neural mechanisms contributing to identity, intrinsic motivation, deep learning, and generative, creative, and abstract thought. Her work has a special focus on adolescents from low SES communities, and she involves youths from these communities as junior scientists in her work. We are so delighted, thrilled to have Mary Helen with us today. And with that, I will pass the proverbial baton or microphone over to her.
Thank you, Julie. Are you seeing my slides?
Yes, we are.
Okay, great. I don't know why there's no little green box around it, but I guess this is how we're doing it these days. No green box. Okay. So hi everyone. It's really great. It's really great to have the opportunity to talk with you. I think what you're thinking about and working on is so important for young people. And I hope that in the next 45 minutes, I give you a sense of why I think so, that, how engaging with art, the art making process, making meaning out of other people's art, analyzing the creative process from an artistic perspective is such an important way to tap into young people's learning. And so I'm going to just kind of take you into a little bit about why I think so, and some of the work that we're doing with teenagers that shows us, what kinds of patterns of thinking actually appear to grow their brains over time, and how that impacts them as young adults. And then we can sort of retro think back. Well, then what would it mean for the kinds of experiences that we want our young people to have to be able to grow into the happy adults who can think and be purposeful and curious and civically minded. And I think that art has a major place in that for young people. So I'm just going to dive right in. I called the talk "Solving the Frankenstein Problem." And I think you'll understand why as I go through, because, so often in education, and I suspect I'm kind of teaching the choir here because because you're already engaging in teaching a subject to young people that is not necessarily valued the ways that other more academic subjects are in all schools. But so often in education we think about young people as having these kind of component mechanisms, right? We use the science to do good science, we have to deep dive into specific dimensions or aspects or mechanisms of thinking and of learning. And then we extract those back out of the scientific laboratory and we think about, well, so then how do we apply those in the classroom? How do we translate those for practice? And I think that's really not a productive way to think about it for the most part, except in very specific situations, because we're not little Frankenstein monsters, right? We are not. You don't have reading mechanisms and working memory and social emotional well-being and cultural heritage and ethnic identity and artistic talent all sort of like sewn together into this kind of monster in the middle. As a teacher, what you've got is Jose or Maria or whoever it is you've got who's engaging with the learning process, with the people around them, with the cultural setting in which they're growing and learning, with the opportunities that they're afforded in their educational settings, in whatever way they bring, right? In whatever way they can kind of conjure up for themselves. And, we don't, even though as scientists, we often have to divide people into these little mechanisms to be able to study the dimensions of the brain or the parts of the brain and things like that. In real people, we never have these little mechanisms separate from each other. You never have learning and engagement independent from emotion, independent from the way you feel in that setting, independent from the history and the authentic self that you bring to that interaction or opportunity. These things are absolutely intertwined with one another in the brain, in our mind, and in the ways in which we think and learn through our culturally afforded opportunities to think and learn, for example, in education. As teachers, we often are expected to try to sew together the Frankenstein monster, right? And that's what it means to translate the science over. But in fact, we need to step back and instead bring a different kind of lens, bring a lens of development, bring a lens of the social, the emotional, the cultural, the cognitive dimensions of that child's thinking and learning, and our own thinking and learning for that matter, and think about how those dynamically, synergistically are ramping off one another, how they're working together to produce all of what a child is capable of thinking about and feeling about and doing and producing. And that's a much more holistic, kind of whole child, also developmental and culturally situated way to think about the education process than we often do because of the kinds of structures and incentives and assessments and traditions that we have in the education sphere. But I think if there's anything that we're learning from the neuroscience right now, it's that those carving the human into these little separate pieces is really can be useful in a laboratory, but is not useful, particularly in an education setting, and doesn't really lead to the kind of thinking that promotes healthy growth and development and good thinking. And so, I start with this painting that was done by a colleague and friend of mine, Margaret Lazari, who was the chair of the Fine Arts Department at the University of Southern California until last year when she retired. And she and I met on the public bus on the way to campus, and we started talking about our work. I was telling her about the kinds of learning I was doing about how young people make meaning, how they experience the world, how they build narratives out of the things they witness and feel, and how those narratives actually appear to be a force in their own growth and development. The story they tell, the way they feel, the dispositions they bring to the process of making meaning out of the things they witness and experience and engage with appears literally to grow their brain over time. And in turn, the way in which they do this and in turn grow their brains that we can actually measure and see through comparison of looking at somebody's brain at age 15 and again 2 years later, we can predict how they're going to grow themselves based on how they're making sense of the world, based on the proclivities and the dispositions they bring, not based on their socioeconomic status, is interesting, not based on the level of education of their parents, not based on their IQ, right? Based on the propensities to look for the bigger meaning, based on their curiosities that they express to us when we engage them in storytelling, for example. And in turn, that brain development statistically mediates. In other words, it kind of explains how the ways in which they're thinking and feeling at the beginning of the experiment at age 15 produce their proclivities to say they feel good as young adults, to rate that they like themselves more, they like their close relationships more, they feel like the opportunities that they have in their life, in work, in school, in parenting, whatever it is they're doing, are what they always hoped for themselves. The coherence of their identity, for those of you who are familiar with like Erickson, right? The notion that they're sort of frame their identity around a set of core values that move with them through their life, as compared to saying like, I don't really know what I believe in or what I care about. I just kind of go along with what everybody else thinks is good, which is exactly not what we want for our young people, right? So what we're finding is that young people's dispositions to engage with meaning making, to deeply narratize and experience and represent those experiences of the world, is growing them over time in ways that build them into civically minded, happy, productive young adults. And, when I explained that to Margaret, and then she talked to me about the work that she was doing, representing the dynamic sort of ecological nature of biology and of humans and of the world, and the kind of interspersing of biological life forms into the physical life, into the physical setting, and how these things are impacting on one another and shaping one another over time. We thought we should collaborate and do something. And just to be clear, like Margaret did almost all of it. But what I did was provide her with the pictures of these little white squiggles that are in the middle of this gigantic, what in real life is a gigantic 6 by 8 foot watercolor, like just an incredibly vibrant painting. And those little white squiggles kind of look like, reminiscent of a reflection of the clouds or of waves in the water. And what they actually are is the white matter of one brave woman's brain, right? We put someone in the scanner, in our fMRI scanner, and we took pictures of their brain, right, using neuroimaging. And then we kind of stripped off the outside all of the little cells, the so-called cortex or bark around the outside of the brain that do all the firing, right? So we stripped those off the pictures, not off the woman, okay, just to be clear. And what's left underneath is this massive billions of interconnected little microscopic tails of saltwater, basically these incredibly fragile little tubes that are connecting one neuron to on average 200,000 other neurons across the space of the head in these very carefully sculpted, experience-based, genetically based, evolutionarily cultivated, right, networks of connectivity that go all the way, around the head and down into the body and back up from the body, that make this woman whose brain this is, right, her. Right, these networks are built out of the way she's thought and felt and lived, and out of her evolutionary history and her genetics and her physical health and everything she's eaten, and all of this comes together to sculpt these amazingly complex networks that are the substrate of our whole organismic self, right? And what I love about this painting that Margaret did is that, she didn't kind of paint these brain structures that I was sending her, in some kind of analytic way in the corner, like where we could all put on our scientific glasses and study them in great depth as to their properties and things. What she's done is painted these networks of connectivity, of functional sort of interconnectedness around the cells of the brain and body into this vibrant seascape of life. She shows how the functioning networks of a person's brain are not kind of separate from the body, the mind, the culture, the time, the physical world that that person is living in, that these things are literally surrounding and kind of sloshing back and forth the connectivity of that brain and holding it together, keeping it from smushing under its own weight on the ground, literally. And, you know, she's got little weeds swimming up, you know, poking up on the bottom of this brain, and she's got little red fish swimming by to represent the creativity of our spontaneous ideas, and warm yellow sunlight shining down onto these networks of this brain. And it's that way that we like to think about the development of the brain. That, you know, we so often think of the brain as separate from the person, but in fact, our brains are us. But it's not just our brains, it's our brains and our bodies and the mind, and that we build from those working together that makes us us. And, you know, just to kind of bring this home in a sort of intuitive, visceral way, right? This is a picture of my sister with my little niece, Nina, who was about 2 hours old in this picture. And Nina was the smaller of a pair of twins, and she was born in an emergency C-section where she and her sister were both anesthetized, and my sister was anesthetized during the birth. And this is the first time that they've met each other when they're both awake. And, you know, Nina is like 3 3/4 pounds and 2 hours old in this picture. And yet, you know, there's so many things you could talk about here, but Nina doesn't come with nothing, right? She comes, you know, she can't quite control her hands and her posture and her head, but she just is genetically, evolutionarily sort of built to look for, right? And reflexively respond to and stare at 2 dark dots in this kind of configuration, right? Not 3, not going like this, not flashing, 2 just like this, right? And she brings that, built by her evolution, into the visual system of her brain. And then along comes another person who is invested in Nina, who cares about Nina, right? Who is engaging with her in what you might call a relationship, right? In cultural learning. And sort of when the situation is right, and Nina's not hungry, and she's not crying, and she's not asleep, and she doesn't need a diaper, and all that sort of helps her set up the context, right? Holds together the parts that Nina can't hold for herself yet, and sets her up so that she can invoke that reflex in the service of something bigger, right? She can engage that automatic propensity to stare at dots in the service of something more than just what it comes as in its innate form. And that is the essence of development and learning and education. It's taking what we bring and elaborating that through experience in a social and cultural space around making and constructing meaning together. It's affective, it's cultural, it's social, it's cognitive, it's behavioral, it's physiological, all at once. We're not little Frankenstein monsters, right? We are whole beings who bring all of those dimensions all the time. And, you know, don't try to read this unless you're a kindergarten teacher or have a kindergartner at home. I'll read it to you. But, you know, this is just another example to kind of bring us forward into the, you know, from the newborn infant to like the kindergartner, right? This was done by my daughter, Nora, when she was, you know, I don't know, 5 and a half, 6 or something like that. And she's, you know, she decided to make a song for her baby brother, Theodore, whom she calls Teddy. And this is literally just a picture of what she made, right? I just scanned it in our scanner at that time. And, you know, you can see a crayon drawing there of her with her pink dress and pink shoes. She didn't even have pink dress and shoes, right? Her favorite color was brown, but, you know, whatever. In her mind, when you're performing something important and you're a girl, you should have a pink dress and shoes on, apparently. And then she's got her music stand there with her squiggly music on it. You get a little bit of the kind of cultural affordances of what she was learning to do. And there she is singing the song, which I won't sing for you. I'll just read it to you, which she wrote for her baby brother, Theodore, whom she calls Teddy. She says, "Oh, Teddy, we love you more than the whole earth size. As the earth spins every day, we love you as much as usual, but sometimes even more, as you make us proud and happy that you're you." there's so many things we could talk about here, but I just have a simple question for you to reflect on. Is this a song or a poem about this little girl's love for her baby brother? Or is this a poem about her budding interest in planetary science? Right? It's absolutely both of those things. She brings to the world a propensity to engage in relationships. She experiences her close relationships in this deeply, emotional way. And she also is in awe of, these things she learns about the situation around her. We told her, you're living on a planet and it's a big ball of dirt in the space and it's spinning around, and that's what makes days and nights, and it's going like this and it doesn't look round, but that's because it's so big, or whatever it is we told her. And she's trying to get her head about that. And then she's also trying to articulate the way she feels about her baby brother, which was incredibly intense. And to her, those two things come together, right? They actually feel like the same feeling to her. And so she conceptually links these and decides to create a piece, right? A song in this case, or a poem about how those actually go together, right? Oh, Teddy, we love you more than the earth size, right? It's like the whole earth size. It's this huge thing and this huge thing. Those are the same thing, and she pulls it together, right? This is the beginning of our human artistic tendency, just shown, right? We are driven to express ourselves, to express the feelings and the narratives and the experiences we have, and to represent those for other people and to share those with other people. And that's the essence of where art comes from. No other animal makes art the way we do. They decorate, they flirt, right? They do all kinds of things that are sort of aesthetic, but we are the only creature who seems to extend that to this bigger generative meaning making, connecting ideas with feelings, connecting information you've learned that you really don't have any deep experience with, like that the world is a gigantic planet spinning every day, with the experience of loving your brother and noticing that those goes together and building this bigger conceptual understanding of both things on the basis of the fact that they feel the same to you. That affordance, that opportunity to engage in that kind of generative meaning making is in essence what art does for young people. I mean, I think all scholarly activities should do this, but it's especially obvious or straightforward in the artistic process when art is encouraged well, and it's why it's so important for kids. So the big kind of picture here, the theme is that emotions are automatic, right? If you feel love for your baby brother, you automatically show the physiological and hormonal and pheromonal and heart rate response and blood pressure response and all this that goes along with cuddling up your baby brother and snuggling him or whatever it is you're going to do. You don't have to stop and think of each of those pieces and make them go in a conscious way. But what I would argue is that what we do need to learn to do in a conscious way is to learn how to have experience, to construct conscious awareness of, to build a narrative or a story or an understanding of the meaning of those emotional responses. And that is the essence of education right there. In a nutshell, no matter what domain you're working in, what I think we need to do is build the ability for young people, help them, I should say, help them develop the ability to be interested in math, to be excited by chemistry, to be expressing themselves through poetry or painting or appreciating history and through another person's poetry or painting, right? To engage with that process and proclivity of building a bigger narrative, of extracting a broader lesson, an ethical judgment, a time and place, right? A historical storyline that becomes part of our identity, part of our belief system, part of what we gather around as a cultural species. We need to learn how to do that. We learn to engage in that kind of meaning making, and that is the purpose of education. And so we need to really ask ourselves, for everything that we have children doing in school, how are they learning how to feel about and think about, which is really two ways to say the same thing, the complexity of the world, right? Just like Nora is thinking about, if you want to do it that way, planetary science, and feeling about her brother. There are really two things, two ways to express the same emotional state that she's building into a story of who she is over time. And I'm happy to say now, she just finished her first year of university studying planetary health and ecology, right? I mean, it started when she was little. So I'm going to take you for just a moment into a little bit of a video clip of a NOVA episode where we were featured that came out a couple of years ago, because it gives you an intuitive sense of how we do some of the work that I'm going to show you the data from with teenagers around meaning making. You know, they really, they shrink it way down because it's, you know, it's just for a quick public, you know, entertainment version, but it gives you a sense of what the lab looks like and how we do our work. So you'll see a young person who comes to sit with me while I share with her true documentary stories about teenagers from around the world. And she just reacts to them and explains how she feels about them. And then we move her into the scanner and we look at how her brain activity and her physiological activity in her body are changing as she experiences and makes meaning of those stories. And then we look for patterns of correspondence, right? Developmental patterns of meaning making and thinking and feeling and ethical deliberation and civic engagement and all this kind of stuff that goes along with these developmental patterns in the brain. And we look at how these are actually feeding off each other, how they're actually two ways to look at the development of a human being and to think about how we should be focusing our efforts and what we should be caring about and paying attention to when we design educational opportunities for kids. So it's just a couple of minutes long.
Hey, welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm Mary Helen. Nice to meet you.
Did it stop?
Yes, it's paused just for a second.
No, I don't know what happened there. Okay.
Since her days
Looks like we got it again.
University of Southern California neuroscientist Mary Helen Immordino-Yang has been interested in knowing how emotions factor into learning.
I quickly realized that there was very, very little known about the kind of stuff that we really care about in education, like how people become inspired. How do we become interested in things? How do we build curiosity? And how can we support that process?
In trying to identify which parts of the brain are involved in the deepest and most meaningful learning, Immordino-Yang works with teens from troubled neighborhoods.
We're going to be watching stories. We really want to know what you think, so there's no right or wrong answers. These are kids who see a lot of crime, they see a lot of dangerous things, they see a lot of poverty. And we wanted to understand, how do they make meaning of that world around them? This first one is a story about a girl who lives in Swat, Pakistan. And the city was being taken over and basically run by a group called the Taliban. So I want you to watch her when she was 12 years old.
First, she gets them emotionally engaged in a topic by showing them videos about people struggling to overcome adversity.
And I want to become a doctor.
So how does her story make you feel?
This story makes me feel upset how she wants to be a doctor and continue on with her education, but it makes her sad that knowing her journey would be very difficult.
For adolescents, these types of stories can trigger moments of deep reflection.
They come back from those kind of reflective moments with this heightened appreciation of the meaning of the story and what it applies to in their own life and what it means for the nature of the world more broadly.
And it's crazy how it's that powerful.
Whereas we've known that for a long time in education, the neural data are giving us new insights into the mechanics of that process. Over here.
To find out which brain regions are harnessed during reflective emotion, Immordino-Yang monitors the students' brain activity as they re-watch the emotional videos in an fMRI scanner.
Hi, Estella, how you doing in there? Good. So we're looking at the movement of the blood flow in her brain as she's watching the stories, and where in her brain is becoming more and less active as she's experiencing these emotions.
She found that the reflective thinking caused by these emotional videos triggers widespread activity throughout the brain.
The most high-level brain states that people experience in the scanner don't just activate high-level systems. They also activate lower-level structures of the brain that are involved in regulating and monitoring your consciousness and your survival.
Immordino-Yang believes that the reason why learning and emotion seem so intimately connected is because complex emotion, like admiration, can activate basic brain functions, like those regulating breathing and heart rate.
We think that the reason that humans' values and belief systems and ideals are such powerful motivators is literally that they're hooking themselves into biomechanical machinery that has evolved to keep us alive over time. So emotions are a critical piece of learning always. Meaningful learning, learning that really matters to you, that changes who you are, and that endures over time, always has an emotional component.
So I would draw upon any of these.
Her research shows that engaging students on an emotional level makes for more powerful learning experiences.
Okay, so you get a little bit of a taste of how we do the work, right? So the same kids are sitting with us and telling us what they think and feel about these complex stories. We're also interviewing them about their lives, about what they see in their communities, about the crime they've witnessed and what they think could be done about it, why they think it happens like that. You know, we talk to them about their possible future self, who they want to be someday, and, you know, all kinds of things. And then we try to figure out, you know, what are these patterns and dispositions that kids show us that are related to their culture, that are related to their way of feeling and thinking for themselves and making meaning. And how do those actually interact with biological development over time to grow a young person who feels happy and well and who is disposed to make the kinds of meaning that lead to purpose, that lead to a happy life, to lead to civic engagement and to ethical deliberations. And what we find here, which my little nephew, Nina's older brother, is showing so nicely, right, is that the same systems in the brain that are used to conjure consciousness in the most basic sense, like consciousness as compared to coma, right, are sort of repurposed and tickled up, so to speak, in the service of constructing complex emotions about stories, about the things that you witness and the things you try to understand, basically thinking about things that you can't see in the here and now, but that you have to infer and make sense out of, make a story out of to be able to understand. Everything from, you know, why a ball rolls down a ramp is the same reason that the tides, you know, are, you know, going up and down at the beach shore, right? The story for how that happens like that, and the story for why, you know, social injustice happens the way it does, or the story for how I feel as I do in this particular situation or relationship. These complex deliberations involve brain systems that construct a sense of self in the most basic sense, and that literally feel and regulate your body. And this is why meaningful learning that really endures over time, that is stuff you can use, not just look up on Google and recall in a test, right, is always connected to the emotional experience of having thought about it, right? It's part of the whole narrative that's constructed around why things work the way they do. And again, just to take this back to art, this is why the process of art making and of engaging with understanding of art is you know, exemplifying some of the best pedagogical opportunities that young people have, because it's expressly about trying to understand what was this person trying to express, what is the meaning they were depicting, what are the experiences, what are the facts, what are the you know, the objective things about the use of color or line or history, right, that actually undergird the way in which you experience the thing they're presenting you with. What do they want you to feel and know about? And all good scholarly thinking, all civic thinking, all you know, cultural thinking is basically organized around those aims, and art is the pinnacle of that. So I'm just going to show you a little bit in the brain, and I've written a lot about these data, and we've done much more work since these data were collected that you can find on our website, candle.usc.edu. But I'm just going to sort of take you to the first pass just to see, on average, what do people activate in their brains? And these data that I'm about to show you actually come from adults across a lifespan, age 20 to 57, I think, in our first study back in 2009, which was meant to just kind of uncover what are the big patterns of activations in the brain when people are experiencing deep, emotionally engaged, meaning-making and thinking about something complex, as compared to when they say, you know, I'm not very moved by this right now. It's, you know, I'm paying attention, but I don't find it particularly compelling or interesting. And, you know, and the more they are emotional about it, also the more they remember it 5 years later in a surprise test, the teenagers, right? So, you know, thinking in this deeper way actually also promotes learning in the sense of memory and recall, if we care about that in education. So what I'm going to show you here is just a picture of one person's brain, right? On the left-hand side, it's kind of sliced through this way. You can see their nose and their tongue and the spinal cord going down. And this is the brain stem under here. If you've heard of, like, you know, the original like triune brain theory of brain evolution from Paul MacLean and stuff, which turns out really not to be right. But nonetheless, like, you know, he was looking and saying, well, this is the stem of the brain. This is the basic kind of densely packed set of nuclei that sits in between, literally the stalk that sits in between the whole rest of the brain on the top and the body and face on the bottom, right? And kind of funnels all the information coming from the body to the brain and from the brain to the body, which is far below the level of conscious awareness and is absolutely essential for survival, obviously, because your brain can't control your body, can't make your heart beat and stuff if you don't have that connection. And then on the right is a picture of the same person's brain, like sliced across this way and turned up. So you're seeing the forehead across the top of the image and the back of the head across the back, and sort of slicing through this way and looking. And so what we think these data show us, which we've now done a lot of work to try to unpack, is that emotional engagement with the thinking process activates the same brain systems that keep you alive, right? No wonder we care so much about how we think and feel. We are the only species that will, go on a hunger strike to make a moral or ethical point, right? We actually are so incredibly empowered by the space of our ideas, by the abilities we have to express our experience to others, and we're deeply saddened and made lonely when we don't have the opportunity to share in those ways. The essence of our biology at this point in late stage in our evolution is that we are deeply socially engaged with one another and deeply culturally co-constructing the meaning that we make. And we can't live alone anymore. Even if we're physically alone at one time or working on our own, we are working from a space of collectively constructed meaning and cultural values and beliefs about what's beautiful and what's relevant and what's even, what even exists is sort of agreed upon together. And in that sense, we're building this meaning together. And so these orange spots are the places in the brain where there was more activation systematically when people told us from the scanner by pushing buttons, I feel really moved by this right now, as compared to when they thought about stories and said, I don't feel really moved by this right now, right? And everywhere that's not turned orange is the same, activated the same for both, right? It's not that it's not activated, it's that it's activated the same amount, no matter how strongly you feel. So what we're seeing is the places that are either more or less activated in blue when people feel strongly emotional. And I'm gonna just point you, in the interest of time, to a couple of key things that I want you to notice about this. First of all, the brainstem, right? We see very organized, concerted activations. This is the bottom of the field of view of the scanner, right? In the medulla. If you get damage in the medulla, which is right above the spinal cord, we can't even keep you alive on life support. Short of defibrillating your heart with every beat, you stop breathing, you become completely physiologically dysregulated, and you rapidly die. And yet, when people are thinking about something that feels deeply ethically or morally or socially powerful to them, they our data suggests are literally activating regions of the brainstem that are the same ones that manage your physiology and keep you alive. These ones here in the midbrain and the mesencephalon, if you get damage in these regions, you get all kinds of profound disturbances of self-awareness and cognition, like coma and persistent vegetative state. And we also see other activations that I think are incredibly important and interesting for educators to know about, which we now have studied extensively how these map onto cultural experience and traumatic experience and development and individual variation. But what we also find is on average, when people say they feel really strongly about what they're thinking about, we get these massive activations in these regions called the anterior insula, which are kind of like folded underneath now we're up in the cortex, the stuff we have so much more of than the other apes and all that we're so proud of. And what do these regions do? Every part of the brain basically has an evolutionarily specified day job, basically, that is involved in some kind of physiological or survival related activity, right? Movement or perception, or regulating appetite, like all these kinds of functions that are essential for organismic survival. We don't have more brain that kind of evolved to layer on top of that, like hats. Instead, we repurpose the parts of our brain that are involved in these basic physiological regulatory things, and we sort of elaborate them into these cognitive circuits that allow us, and affective circuits that allow us to think and feel in all the ways that are characteristically human. They're not, those thoughts and feelings are not separate from survival. They become a part of it and integrated into it with development. And so in this picture, which is from Grey's Anatomy, right, the textbook, not the TV show, right? Somebody has resected, right? The eyeball goes here, right? And you can sort of, these are the side of the brain. If you were to open up, there's this big crack there that you could kind of peel open, and underneath there's this huge piece of tissue. And we've known something about what this tissue does, especially up here under my cursor in the front, since about the 1950s, when a famous neuroscientist called, or neurosurgeon named Wilder Penfield was doing groundbreaking epilepsy surgeries, resection surgeries, to try to save people from epileptic seizures that were threatening their lives, basically. And what he would do is put a person they first localize approximately where the seizure was using electrodes, right? But then they would put them to sleep, open up their head and brain, and then wake them back up again. And you don't feel anything on your brain, so the person's okay. And they'd poke around and stimulate different parts of the brain that they were about to cut out to find out how it would impact the person, so that they could try to do as little damage as possible, not take out their primary language or something like that, their memory for their grandmother or something, in solving their seizure. And so he made the first maps of the alive, awake human brain that we had, but long before scanning was invented, in vivo scanning. And so when he poked around up in here, what happened was basically people vomit. They get other kinds of gastromotoric responses and intestinal contractions and things, which I won't describe in polite company, which he basically discovered this is what we now know as visceral somatomotor cortex. It's the part of the brain that is feeling and regulating the state of your guts and viscera and digestion. And what we found is that when people thought about things that they found deeply meaningful or deeply emotional, that they were really engaged with by their own report, we get massive activations in these anterior insular regions. These are the same regions that Wilder Penfield pokes and people puke, right? We literally seem to use the neural platform that allows us to know if we have a stomach ache or if our heart's pounding or if we're cold, right? As a sort of platform on which to experience the meaningfulness, the emotionality, the subjective power of the things we think about. Our physiological selves and our cultural and education selves and our mental selves are not separate from each other. We are not Frankensteins, right? And then one other finding I'm just going to point out in the last few minutes that we've also spent a lot of time understanding this and looking at how it develops in teenagers and all these kinds of things, is something else that we found in these data that at first kept us from publishing for a while, because it was really, we could not figure out why we would have these activations, right? And to my knowledge, we're the first, one of the first scientific experiments that actually showed activations in these regions when people were asked to think about something and do a task, right? Think about something difficult to think about, and not just like relax and rest, right? These regions, which are deep in the core of the head, had been shown to be activated by some really clever experiments in like the early 2000s by Marcus Rakel and his colleagues at University of Washington, St. Louis, who got a very clever idea. Basically, you know, the new neuroimaging, fMRI, was being used to study all kinds of processing of input, right? We give you math problems, what happens in your brain? We give you, you know, scary dogs growling at you, what happens in your brain? We give you, you know, language, or we give you pictures of babies crying or pornography or something. And like, we look, what happens in your brain is what people were doing. And they thought, what would happen if we asked people in the scanner just kind of relax and think about nothing? You know, just, we won't give you anything to look at, just, you know, close or open your eyes, just don't fall asleep, but just, you know, relax and rest, don't think about anything in particular. And he showed that there were these concerted activations deep in the core of the head that are in among the most metabolically expensive tissues in the entire human body, right? Underneath this circle right here where my cursor is, you use more energy and glucose and oxygen and glucose rather per unit time in this region when you're just daydreaming than the same size tissue in the middle of your thigh muscle uses in that much time when you're in the middle of running a marathon. These are incredibly expensive tissues. How could they be super active when you're resting and thinking about nothing? And the other side of that is super suppressed and deactivated and quiet when you are asked to do something difficult, like math problems or memorizing, like here's a stream of pictures coming at you and you got to remember which one happened 2 times ago and push the button every time you see it again, and all these kinds of things where it's really hard. Ours was among the first studies ever that when we asked people to do something in the scanner, not just rest and relax, they activated these regions. What did we ask people to do? Tell us how you feel about this. Think about how you are reacting to this and tell us if it's meaningful to you. Think about how emotionally engaged you are with this complex idea. What we now know about these regions is that they are a kind of inner platform for mapping the state of viscera and consciousness and awakeness, and for thinking about things that don't actually exist in the here and now. Things you can't look into the world and see. And we actually have a whole series of interesting studies where we watch and people literally close their eyes or look up to the ceiling and roll their eyes and stuff when they invoke these networks in their brain, because it's too much. Don't show me stuff out here. I need to think and feel and think about what does this all mean inside me, right? So as we're thinking about the art making process and the process of engaging with arts others have made, how do we support kids in engaging with what's there, but then internalizing it and constructing this bigger experience around it that makes it part of who you are, right? And then coming back out to engage with each other. It's about this, it's almost like a seesaw, I'm thinking of it as, you know, it's about this recentering of yourself around these inner and outer ways of thinking and being. We've written a lot about this. I've written a lot about this. If you go to Candle, you can pull down papers that will help you deep dive into this if you're interested. So the basic big picture here is that thinking deeply is essentially telling complex emotional stories to yourself about what things mean and about how they work. And if you're little Nora, it's connecting the feeling of how I feel when I'm with my baby brother to the feeling of how I feel when I'm thinking about how amazingly awe-inspiring this incredible planet Earth is, and noticing that those feel the same. And so they maybe are the same thing, and pulling them together. For me, then there at age 6, right? And so this opens up a lot of interesting questions that I'm going to leave you with around, you know, what is this kind of balance in the brain systems around, they're both cognitive and emotional, both, right? It's not like emotion's one and cognition's the other. It's all cognition and emotion all the time, right? Is the first thing to think about. But what does this balance mean for students' well-being, for character development, right? What is character? It's not just what you do, it's the intentions behind what you do. It's the deeper meaning, it's the story, it's the understanding of the social justice orientation you bring to this interaction or whatever it is, right? How do these insights change how we think about what counts as productive, right? It's just moving your pencil on your paper or moving your mouth or moving your paintbrush, you know, is that production? Or is there another side of productivity or critical thinking that's hidden, that's internal, that takes time? And what might it mean for how we use technology, right? If things are dinging at us and interacting with us and giving us feedback on how we did, ding, you got it right, move on to the next one, blah, blah, blah. Like, how is that shaping the way young people develop the networks of their brain? Because we know we grow our brain around the ways we use it. And how does that interaction with those opportunities and experiences develop certain proclivities toward thinking potentially in superficial or appearance-oriented or action-oriented ways only moving forward, right? And it's not that you want all inward either. You need kids to move back and forth between these. And so the parting little, you know, kind of summary that I'm going to leave you with today is this notion that, you know, what we're coming around to in my work is that meaningful learning is meaningful because it shifts students from having emotions about outcomes, like what did you make? What grade did you get? Did you remember this? Did you get it right? Are you done? Did you not get it right? Are you not done? Did you get an A+? Did you get an F? What happened, right? What college did you get into or not get into? To emotions about ideas. How do we shift our education system so that the emotions people in the system are having, both the teachers and the students, are much more about the ideas than they are about the outcomes, and the outcomes will follow. So thank you, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Mary Helen. There were so many profound statements in that. I just took a ton of notes and look forward to just reflecting on those and adding.
Yeah, there's a lot of ideas.
So many powerful ideas.
Yeah.
Wow, that was a feast. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I will read out a few questions from the chat for us. There's one that came in earlier asking about the difference between what you're talking about with emotional learning and the difference between that and empathy.
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. So, so what is empathy? So I think of all of these as having all of these emotional and cognitive things, right? Empathy is both emotional and cognitive, right? You can have affective empathy, which is just feeling somebody else's, you know, emotion with them, right? In a kind of resonant way. You can have cognitive empathy, which is another way to say perspective taking, right? I'm sharing your mind state or your understanding state with you. But both of those can exist in this kind of immediate context dependent way, or they can exist in this more transcendent, deeper way. And I didn't have a chance to really unpack what I mean by that in this talk, but I've done it in a lot of other places and talks, or people can follow up. But the idea is that, you know, you can engage with empathy right here, right now. I see somebody go, oh, well, let me help you, right? Oh, you need a hug, or they smile and I smile back. And that's really important, okay? And then there's also a different version or a different sort of level of construal where you actually detach from what I see right in front of me. And I think instead about what is the bigger context here? What is the bigger intention? Quality of mind, quality of character, virtue, historical precedent and context. What is the possible future outcome space of this? And when you think in that space, then what's happening right here, right now is actually a distraction. You need to be able to transcend that to put these ideas all together into a bigger story about why what I'm seeing right here, right now actually is an example of something that's bigger, right? This is all about learning to recognize situations that are inherently biased against certain groups of individuals, like racial bias built into institutions, things like that, right? It's not about here and now necessarily. It's about the entire the historical context that makes what happens here and now have a different significance than it might otherwise if you weren't familiar with the history, right? And it's about being able to know how and when is appropriate to engage right here, right now, which is very important. You need to notice the people around you. You need to be empathic with the people around you and engaged and appropriately behaving and all that. But that's not enough. And so much of what we do in social emotional learning, so to speak, is focused almost exclusively, if not exclusively, on that level of interaction, which is important, but it is not enough. You need to also be able to transcend and build the deeper kinds of stories that help you understand and interpret news situations when you get into them, or historical events, or political leanings, all these kinds of bigger ideas that are not things you can directly look at and see. You need to have a propensity or disposition to engage in the deeper context. And that is also in a kind of elaborated state of empathy or feelings.
Thank you, Mary Helen. There's another question about the science behind extrinsic rewards versus intrinsic learning, and how to spark intrinsic learning.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's very related to what I'm talking about here. I particularly like a guy named Ko Moriyama's work on this. I'll put his name in the chat in a second. I think you need both, right? But the problem is so many of the structures that we have and the assessments and the milestones and the valued metrics in our education system are exclusively focused on extrinsic reward, right? And so extrinsic things, rewards and prizes and being done and all that kind of stuff, or fear and punishment and having to go to summer school if you don't do it and all that, are useful, right? They're useful carrots and sticks, and they move you a little bit, right? To varying degrees for different people. But the issue is that they also do two things. They first, and this is like experimentally shown, it devalues the content of what you're actually achieving. And instead, it replaces the value of that context, like the intrinsic interest of what you're learning about, with the grade you got for doing it. Ko did this really cool experiments, for example, where he asked people to look at, really interesting information about whales and all this stuff, where everybody's like, wow, really? I didn't know whales nurse their young for 2 years or whatever, like just all these interesting facts. I don't know that that's true, stuff like that. Or really boring facts, right? Like, just remember these numbers, or this guy had this batting average or whatever, which was profoundly mediocre and dropped out after that. Just things like, you're like, wait, why do I need to know this? And what he found is that people learned the exciting, interesting stuff much more, and they reported it being much more interesting. Then he started paying people to learn the stuff. Like, I will give you, whatever it is, 10 cents or whatever for every one of these things you get right on the test. And now all of a sudden they don't rate the interesting stuff as interesting anymore, right? It's just the whales aren't interesting anymore, because what do I remember about that? I remember that I got my 10 cents, not that whales nurse their young or whatever it is. So you're basically undermining the long-term aim of education by substituting these short-term rewards and punishments, in for something else. That said, a little bit of that, getting kids motivated in a competition kind of format, or showing off your work and that it's done now and I'm going to be proud of it, that's useful too. But there you're learning something else. You're developing a disposition around being proud of your work, but not around deep thinking about what's in the work. And you need to balance those. We need to really balance those. So intrinsic motivation comes from that deeper place of, default mode reflection. And even the neural systems that are involved in these deeper kinds of motivation that are associated with those brainstem activations and stuff are associated with literally, distancing yourself, closing your eyes. People close their posture, they step back, and then they come in again with a new meaning having been made that feels very deeply relevant to them, like the way that Nora did with her poem, right? Imagine how she might have done that differently if I said to her, that is such a great poem. I'm gonna pay you $10 for that, and you get to watch TV for an extra hour tonight now, right? Like, that totally devalues the amazingness of the poem, as compared to if I just said, like, tell me about your poem. Like, what's beautiful here is the poem and your work on it and your thinking, not what I could come along and replace that with, right? But so much of the structures in our education system are around replacing the kids' agency, the kids' ownership with something we give them, which devalues their own thinking. It basically says your art's not what's important. What's important is that I liked it or didn't.
Very interesting. On the subject of art, there's another question here about brain science and the study of art. So does the brain recognize art as a language that communicates emotion and connection? Are we neurologically pre-wired to make art?
Lots of interesting questions about that. There are many people in the world who are working on exactly those questions. Samir Zeki, Z-E-K-I, in Cambridge is one who's done some very neat work on that. Also, there's a nice book on art and the brain by, I can't think of names of, Nobel laureate who studied memory, and I'll think of it in a minute, who's now, older in New York City at NYU, I believe. I'll think of it in a minute. Anyway, but there are books on the brain and art. It's mostly speculation at this time, but it's really quite interesting. And the bottom line is, yes, we are driven to make aesthetic meaning, right, and to experience art and music and other kinds of aesthetic cultural activities. From all we can tell, human beings have been doing this from the very inception of our species, right? This is a hallmark of us as a species, is that we do cave paintings and sing and things. And so we're driven to kind of exteriorize this meaning. Does that mean that it's all there when you're born? Not any more than, Nina's little gazing eye gaze is all she needs to have relationships, right? You develop these proclivities. You come with a disposition or a hunger for that kind of experience and engagement, and then you develop and elaborate it over time in accordance with your own experiences and culture and ways of knowing and feeling and being and what it is that you want to explain. So yes and no simultaneously, but we are inherently artistic creatures. And, I would also say that, I think of my art, my science as an art almost. I have an aunt who's passed away now, but who was a professor of art and a professional artist. And she and I had long conversations about this, and I've had them with Margaret Lazari also around, the process by which I engage in designing experiments and interpreting data is very much like, if I'm understanding them, the process by which they design a new set of paintings or period of work, is that there's something amorphous they need to express. They're noticing, they want to dive into it more deeply. They want to exchange this in a way, explain this in a way that others will be able to recognize and build from it. And that's very much like the way that I think about science. So, I think this is an innately human way to think about the world, but the domain in which you do it, or the medium in which you do it, right? The art, the numbers, the physics, the perspectives, the feelings, the music, the whatever it is, the living in nature and building a log cabin, right? We're driven to do our own expression of our aesthetic meaning, and that is inherently human.
Thank you so much, Mary Helen. I think that's all the time we have for questions. As we end, I just want to share a slide really quickly to encourage us to reflect in our journals. And let me just expand this one more minute here. We were able to ask some of our questions. I'd like to encourage us to consider what is one takeaway from today's talk that you might document and expand upon in your accordion journal. And I hope you can take some time this evening, in the morning, whenever you're off Zoom, and let your default mode network do its work. It sounds like you'll need a good caloric meal before that, if I'm understanding correctly. It will take as much energy as running a marathon, but take some time to reflect deeply on what you heard today and think of applications. last but not least, in our roadmap, we have at the very end on page 21 some links that you can click on to further explore the ideas in our plenaries today. So we encourage you to check those out, and also go to candle.usc.edu to learn more about Mary Helen's work. So again, Mary Helen, thank you so much for joining us. This has been just an incredible opportunity to hear from you and to bring this scientific piece of the puzzle into our learning journey this week about the role of emotion and cognition, critical thinking, and art, and how all of that plays together in the learning process for our students and for ourselves. So thank you a million, and hope to continue this conversation with you in the future.
Great. No, it's my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for the work you do.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
One
Yep.
slide for a sec.
Yeah, I think somebody was asking, did I see like the question, the slide with my question, like the closing slide? Okay, hold on. Can I kick you off, Julie? All right.
Sure,
No,
absolutely.
it's actually her closing
Oh,
slide.
her
with
closing slide. Oh, don't kick you off. Okay, great.
I'm sorry, what was the request?
The
Let's go back
what is
one
the
slide.
takeaway from today's talk that, and then I missed the rest.
Oh, yes. Let me just share that here. So we'll go back one. There you go.
All right, great. I'm going to hop off.
All
Thank
right.
you so much.
Thank you, Mary
everybody.
Helen.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Sure.
Bye.
Bye.